This is I.J.N. Akagi, the Red Dragon, one of the most powerful aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. At 260 meters in length and carrying 66 fighter aircraft, Akagi was once a symbol of unstoppable naval power. On December 7, 1941, aircraft from Akagi's deck participated in the world-shocking attack on Pearl Harbor. For the next 6 months, this ship swept away every opponent from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. The Japanese believed Akagi was invincible. But it would all end on one fateful morning at Midway, June 4, 1942. This is the story of Akagi's final battle. After the resounding victory at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto planned to capture Midway Island, an important American outpost in the middle of the Pacific. The objective? Lure out the American fleet and destroy it completely. The Japanese strike force was terrifying. 4 heavy aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These were the ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon. They had never known defeat. But the Americans had broken the Japanese JN-25 code. Admiral Nimitz knew exactly when and where Japan would attack. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were waiting in ambush. 4:45 in the morning, June 4th. From the 4 Japanese carriers, the first attack wave took off toward Midway Island. 108 aircraft carrying bombs and torpedoes flew into the dimly lit sky. From Akagi alone, 27 aircraft launched. Everything was going according to plan. But at 7:28 in the morning, a reconnaissance seaplane reported, "Enemy ships spotted." The news struck like lightning. Then at 8:09, the critical message arrived. Enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. Admiral Nagumo fell into a terrible dilemma. The reserve aircraft on deck were being armed with land bombs for a second strike on Midway. But now they needed torpedoes to fight warships. The order was given. Change the weapons. Immediately. On Akagi's hangar deck, hundreds of sailors began removing bombs and replacing them with torpedoes. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines piled up on the deck. And then a worse problem emerged. The aircraft returning from Midway were out of fuel and needed to land urgently. The flight deck had to be cleared to receive them. The rearming process was delayed again. The time was 10:20 in the morning. Akagi was at its most vulnerable moment. Fuel, ammunition, aircraft, everything crowded on deck. One bomb hit would be catastrophic. From 7 o'clock in the morning, American attacks began pouring in. But not all were successful. First came the torpedo planes from USS Hornet. Squadron VT-8 with 15 TBD Devastator aircraft flew low over the water, trying to approach and drop torpedoes. But the TBD Devastator was an old, slow aircraft, achieving only 200 kilometers per hour when carrying torpedoes. 0 fighters from Akagi dove down like hunting hawks. The VT-8 formation was torn apart. 1 aircraft, then 2, then 3, exploded in midair. The remaining aircraft tried to continue, but Akagi's anti-aircraft guns opened fierce fire. Within 10 minutes, all 15 TBD Devastators from VT-8 were shot down. Not one dropped its torpedo. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the sea, watching the entire battle unfold. Next came VT-6 from Enterprise with 14 aircraft, and VT-3 from Yorktown with 12 aircraft. Same fate. They flew into dense fire without fighter escorts. 41 torpedo bombers launched in total. Only 6 returned. Not a single torpedo hit its target. On Akagi's deck, sailors cheered. They had repelled 3 waves of American attacks. It seemed this would be another easy victory. But these failed attacks had created an unexpected consequence. All the Zero fighters were flying low over the water, having chased the torpedo planes. The sky at high altitude was now completely empty. 10:22 in the morning. On Akagi's deck, sailors were rushing to complete arming aircraft with torpedoes. Just 15 more minutes, and they could launch a counterattack wave. From an altitude of 4,500 meters, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, with 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise, were circling, searching for the Japanese fleet. They were almost out of fuel and preparing to return. Then McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer running at high speed. It was Arashi, trying to catch up with the main fleet after attacking an American submarine. McCluskey decided to follow Arashi's course. 10:20 in the morning, 4 Japanese carriers appeared below. No fighters at high altitude. The decks were packed with aircraft being refueled. McCluskey signaled. The entire squadron split up, some targeting Kaga, others targeting other carriers. Only 3 aircraft from Best's section would attack Akagi. The rest of McCluskey's bombers went after Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding a 3-plane section, aimed his small flight straight at Akagi. He dove at a 70-degree angle, speed increasing to 380 kilometers per hour, then 400. Akagi's bullseye, the 260-meter-wide flight deck, became increasingly clear in his bomb sight. At an altitude of 550 meters, Best released his bomb. The 1,000-pound bomb, 454 kilograms, fell freely, spinning through the air, plummeting at terrifying velocity. On Akagi's deck, those who saw it only had time to gape. No time to hide. No time to do anything. 10:22 and 30 seconds in the morning. Best's bomb penetrated the flight deck near the center elevator. It punched through to the hangar deck below before detonating. The explosion tore through the hangar deck. Precisely there, several aircraft were being refueled. Fuel lines burst. Aviation gasoline sprayed out like waterfalls, then ignited immediately. The shockwave swept through rows of aircraft packed tight on the hangar deck. A B-5N Kate, carrying a Type 91 torpedo, was thrown aside. The torpedo flew out of the aircraft's belly, rolled across the deck, its detonator striking a steel column. The torpedo detonated with a thunderous roar. The 200-kilogram warhead tore apart the fuselage of the adjacent aircraft. That aircraft also carried a torpedo. It exploded in turn, then the one beside it. The chain reaction began. Seconds later, either another bomb from Best's wingmen struck, or the secondary explosions were so massive they seemed like another bomb hit. Historical accounts differ. Some say only one direct hit. Others suggest 2. What is certain is that the devastation was catastrophic. The explosion in the hangar deck center, whether from a second bomb or from the massive pile of bombs and torpedoes waiting to be stored, was 3 times more devastating than the first. Dozens of bombs detonated simultaneously. Multiple torpedoes exploded in sequence. The entire center of the hangar deck transformed into a massive fireball. The heat wave spread like an invisible wall, igniting everything within 40 meters. The nearest men burst into flames instantly. They didn't even have time to scream. The explosion's pressure pushed upward, bulging the flight deck. Some deck plates were blown off. Flames shot up through the gaps, burning those standing on the flight deck. In less than 2 minutes, Akagi had become hell. On the flight deck, a massive hole gaped open. From that hole, black smoke rose like a monstrous column. The temperature from below was so high it made the surrounding flight deck steel begin to glow red. Below, in the hangar deck, was an indescribable scene. Temperature exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. Aluminum, the metal of aircraft skin, melted, dripping like rain. Rubber tires burned, creating toxic black smoke. Petty Officer Mitsuo Fuchida, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor attack, was on the bridge level when the bombs fell. The explosion threw him, breaking both legs. When he regained consciousness, he saw a horrific scene. The hangar deck was a sea of fire. Aircraft exploded one by one. Torpedoes detonated with harsh sounds. Men ran wildly, bodies aflame. Some jumped overboard. Some tried to roll to extinguish flames on themselves. I could hear screaming, but the explosions were so loud they almost drowned everything out. In the damage control room, Commander Nakajima tried to assess the situation. Reports flooded in. Hangar deck, fire uncontrollable. Automatic firefighting system destroyed. Multiple secondary explosions. Engine room still secure. Rudder still operational. There was still hope. The engines were running. The ship maintained 28 knots. If they could extinguish the fires, firefighting teams sprang into action. 120 men carrying fire hoses, extinguishers, and extraordinary courage. They advanced into the hangar deck from both ends of the ship. The temperature was too high. Paint on walls spontaneously combusted before flames touched it. Air so hot it was difficult to breathe. Each breath felt like inhaling knives. Teams led by brave warrant officers pushed into the inferno. They opened the water hoses, spraying into the fires. Water evaporated immediately, creating scalding steam. The steam layer obscured visibility. Then another torpedo exploded. The shock wave threw men backward. Some were impaled by metal fragments, but survivors stood up, continued fighting. From the stern, another team tried to advance. They used foam suppressant, hoping to stop the flames. But the fire was too large. Each time they extinguished one spot, 3 others flared up. 10:40 in the morning, just 18 minutes after the bombs fell, a series of explosions shook the entire ship. It was the anti-aircraft ammunition storage near the hangar deck. Thousands of 25mm rounds exploded like fireworks. Shell fragments pierced through bulkheads, shooting into adjacent compartments. Some pierced straight up to the flight deck, killing those trying to fight fires there. Some shot downward, puncturing fuel lines. Fuel spilled out, flowing with the ship's list, creating a stream of burning liquid from midship toward the bow. Fire followed the fuel stream, igniting new blazes. 11 o'clock in the morning, Commander Nakajima was forced to report to Captain Aoki. The situation grows worse. Fire is spreading to new compartments. Casualties are mounting. Some compartments are too hot to enter.
Admiral,
10:46 in the morning, Admiral Nagumo, Fleet Commander, stood on the bridge as communications became increasingly difficult. The bridge was filling with smoke. Fire was threatening to reach the island superstructure.
Admiral,
The Chief of Staff reported, "Admiral, you must transfer your flag. We cannot command the fleet from here." This was a cruel decision. Leaving Akagi meant admitting the ship was defeated. But Nagumo had no choice. He had to save the remaining fleet. Around 11 o'clock, Admiral Nagumo and his staff were transferred to destroyer Nowaki by boat. As he left Akagi, he turned back to look at the ship, tears streaming. "Forgive me, Akagi. I have failed you." But Captain Aoki Taijiro refused to leave. "This is my ship," he said. "I will stay until the end." Noon. The situation became hopeless. Temperature in some compartments had exceeded 70 degrees Celsius. People could not survive there. Firefighting water pipes burst from pressure and temperature. Many hoses had no water. Rescue teams tried to reach trapped sailors in various compartments. But many corridors had become furnaces. Dozens of brave men died trying to save their comrades. Engineering crews worked desperately near the magazines. Their mission? Flood these compartments with seawater before they exploded. If the magazines detonated, the entire ship would break in two. They opened the sea valves. Water rushed in. But the temperature was so high that water boiled upon touching the compartment bottom. Scalding steam severely burned several men. They continued until critical compartments were flooded. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, nearly 4 hours since the bombs fell. The fires remained uncontrolled. Actually, they were spreading. Fire had reached areas dangerously close to the engine rooms. Captain Aoki convened an emergency meeting with remaining officers. The situation was grim. Hangar deck, completely out of control. Firefighting system, 60% damaged casualties. Over 200 dead or seriously wounded engine room, still operational but threatened ship's structure, weakening from heat and explosions. "Is saving the ship possible?" Aoki asked. Silence. Finally, Commander Nakajima spoke. "Sir, with current equipment, I don't think so. The fire is too strong. We're fighting a losing battle." 4:30 in the afternoon, another massive explosion shook the ship, larger than previous ones. Part of the flight deck collapsed into the hangar deck below. Black smoke shot up hundreds of meters. Aoki made the hardest decision of his life. All crew not necessary for keeping the ship afloat prepare to abandon ship. The order spread like a wave of pain. Many men wept openly. Abandon Akagi, the ship that once dominated the Pacific? But orders were orders. Lifeboats were lowered. Destroyers Arashi and Nowaki moved alongside to receive survivors. Groups were evacuated one by one. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, most of the crew had been evacuated. Captain Aoki made a final inspection, checking compartments that could still be accessed, ensuring no living soul remained behind. He was the last to leave Akagi, departing around 5:15 in the afternoon after ensuring all survivors had been rescued. As his boat pulled away from the hull, Aoki turned back to look at Akagi one last time. The ship still floated, but the entire midsection burned fiercely. Black smoke obscured half the sky. "Sayonara, Akagi," he whispered. "Night of June 4th, 1942. Akagi still floated like a burning ghost ship. Fires blazed throughout the hull. Occasionally an explosion tore through the darkness. The ship listed to starboard but stubbornly remained afloat. 4 destroyers, Arashi, Nowaki, Hagakaze, and Maikaze, circled around Akagi like mourners at a funeral. They had to remain to protect the ship, guarding against further American attacks. But they also awaited final orders from Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto was hundreds of kilometers away on battleship Yamato. He received reports about Akagi. The ship could not be saved. Fire still raged uncontrolled, but the carrier also could not be left to fall into enemy hands or become a hazard to navigation. A decision had to be made, and it was one of the most painful decisions an admiral could make. Dawn of June 5th. An encrypted message reached the fleet. "Scuttle Akagi." On destroyer Arashi, the squadron commander received the order. He stood still, hands trembling, holding the paper. Around him, officers were silent. Some wept openly. "Fire! We must follow orders," he finally said, voice breaking. "Prepare torpedoes." 5 o'clock in the morning. 4 destroyers lined up, about 1,500 meters from Akagi. On each ship, torpedo tubes were turned toward the carrier. Sailors performed their duty with tear-streaked faces, hands shaking as they loaded the weapons. No one wanted to do this, but these were orders. This was the final duty they could perform for Akagi, an honorable death by friendly hands rather than letting the ship fall into enemy hands or sink alone. "Fire!" 4 Type 93 torpedoes, the world's best torpedoes at that time, Launched from their tubes, they left white foam trails on the water, racing at 50 knots toward Akagi. On the destroyers, everyone stood at attention, watching. Many raised hands in final salute. Tears flowed freely down weathered faces. The first torpedo struck Akagi's starboard side near the bow. A massive column of water erupted. The ship shuddered violently. The second torpedo hit amidships. The explosion was tremendous. Akagi began listing more severely to starboard. The third and fourth torpedoes struck the stern section, close together. Two nearly simultaneous explosions cracked the hull structure. Seawater rushed in through 4 massive holes. The damage control system had long been destroyed. There was nothing to stop the flooding. Akagi began her final descent, 5:05 in the morning. The list increased dramatically. Water flooded the hangar deck, finally extinguishing the fires that had burned for over 18 hours. 5:10 in the morning. Akagi listed 30 degrees. The bow dipped lower. The stern began to rise. 5:15 in the morning. The massive carrier rolled onto her side. For a moment she seemed to hesitate, as if reluctant to leave the world she had once dominated. 5:20 in the morning, June 5th, 1942. IJN Akagi slipped beneath the waves. The bow went first, followed by the bridge and island structure. The flight deck, once crowded with aircraft preparing to conquer the Pacific, disappeared under the water. Finally, the stern with its massive propellers rose high, then slowly, majestically, slid beneath the surface. Within moments, only ripples remained where Akagi had been. A few pieces of debris floated on the oil-slicked water. The Red Dragon was gone. On the 4 destroyers, every man stood at attention in absolute silence. Many openly wept. They had just witnessed the end of an era, the death of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. The ship sank to a depth of 5,400 meters, where it would rest undisturbed for 77 years. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan lost 4 carriers in one day: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Along with them went over 300 experienced pilots who could never be replaced. From that day forward, Japan would never regain the initiative. Akagi's story is one of glory and tragedy. From the height of power at Pearl Harbor to destruction at Midway took only 6 months. The ship that had seemed invincible was destroyed not just by American bombs, but by Japanese overconfidence, by a fatal delay in rearming aircraft, by the chaos of split-second decisions in battle. The final toll: approximately 267 men died with Akagi. Hundreds more were wounded. These were experienced sailors and officers who represented years of training and irreplaceable combat experience. In October 2019, 77 years after the battle, the research vessel Petrel discovered Akagi's wreck resting upside down on the ocean floor at 5,400 meters depth. The ship that once ruled the Pacific skies now lies in eternal darkness, a steel tomb for those who went down with her. Rest in peace, IJN Akagi, and all who sailed in her. Imagine a vast, serene Pacific Ocean in the early months of 1942. The Empire of Japan, riding high on a wave of victories, seemed unstoppable. From Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, their navy dominated. But hidden beneath the surface, a single oil slick, a seemingly insignificant trail on the water would change everything. Today, we're diving into the story of the Mikuma, a Japanese heavy cruiser often overlooked in the grand narrative of Midway. Yet, she became a symbol of the quiet collapse of Japan's combined fleet. This is the tale of how one small detail sealed her fate. In the spring of 1942, Japan was at the peak of its power in the Pacific theater of the Second World War. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had crippled the American battleship fleet. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Their carrier task forces roamed freely, striking as far as Ceylon in the Indian Ocean. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, knew this momentum couldn't last forever. America was rebuilding, and Yamamoto believed a decisive blow was needed to force them to the negotiating table. Enter Operation MI, the plan to seize Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of land midway between Hawaii and Japan. Midway wasn't just strategic, it was bait. Yamamoto intended to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap. He assembled the largest naval armada in history, over 200 ships, including 11 battleships, 8 carriers, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. The goal? Annihilate the U.S. Pacific Fleet and secure Japan's defensive perimeter. But unbeknownst to the Japanese, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked JN-25, the Imperial Navy's main operational code. They knew Yamamoto's plans in advance. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, positioned his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown northeast of Midway, ready to spring an ambush. The stage was set for one of the most pivotal battles in naval history. Now, let's zoom in on our protagonist, the heavy cruiser Mikuma. She was part of Cruiser Division 7, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. Mikuma belonged to the Mogami-class innovative ships designed in the 1930s to push the limits of the Washington Naval Treaty. These cruisers were fast, heavily armed, and versatile. Mikuma displaced about 13,000 tons, stretched 570 feet long, and could slice through the waves at 35 knots. Her main battery? 10 8-inch guns and 5 twin turrets, capable of hurling shells over 20 miles. She also carried torpedoes, anti-aircraft guns, and even float planes for reconnaissance. Commissioned in August 1935, Mikuma had already seen plenty of action. She supported the invasion of Malaya, bombarded British forces in the Indian Ocean, and escorted carriers during raids on Darwin, Australia. By May 1942, she was a seasoned veteran, crewed by around 900 sailors and officers, many of whom were battle-hardened from Pearl Harbor. Her captain, Shakao Sakayama, was a capable commander, known for his discipline and tactical acumen. As part of Kurita's force, Mikuma's role in Operation MI was to provide gunfire support for the invasion of Midway and screen the main body of the fleet. She sailed from Guam on May 27, joining the massive formation steaming toward the atoll. The journey was tense but optimistic. Japanese sailors believed in their invincibility. Propaganda painted them as warriors of the divine wind. Little did they know, the Americans were waiting. On June 4, the battle erupted. Japanese carriers launched strikes against Midway, but American torpedo bombers and dive bombers counterattacked. In a span of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze by American SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Later that afternoon, Hiryu was also mortally wounded. Yamamoto's trap had backfired spectacularly. With 4 carriers lost, he canceled the invasion and ordered a general withdrawal. But the damage wasn't done yet. The retreating fleet was vulnerable, scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. Mikuma, along with her sisters Mogami, Suzuya, and Kumano, plus destroyers, was tasked with bombarding Midway as a diversion. That plan was scrapped too. Now they had to race westward, evading American submarines and aircraft. The night of June 5 was pitch black, no moon, heavy clouds. Kurita's cruisers pushed their engines to the limit, zigzagging to avoid torpedoes. Tension gripped the bridges. Lookouts strained their eyes for enemy silhouettes. This was the setup for disaster. According to post-war reports from the Imperial Japanese Navy, the fleet was in disarray. Communications were spotty. Fatigue set in after days at sea. Captain Sakayama later noted in his log, though much of it was lost, that the crew remained vigilant. But the weight of the carrier losses hung heavy. One survivor recalled the mood. Whispers of defeat rippled through the ranks for the first time. Mikuma's position in the formation was critical. As a heavy cruiser, she was the muscle ready to engage any pursuers with her big guns. But in retreat, speed was everything. The Mogami-class ships were among the fastest in the fleet. But even they couldn't outrun fate. As dawn approached on June 6, the real tragedy unfolded. But before we get there, consider this. Midway wasn't just about carriers. It was about the small decisions, the overlooked details, that turned tides. For Mikuma, her mission seemed straightforward: survive and return home. Yet, in the dark hours ahead, a collision would expose her to the merciless skies. What happened next would make her the first Japanese heavy cruiser sunk in the war. Stay with me as we uncover the chain of events that led to her doom. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, where battles are won and lost on razor-thin margins, Mikuma's story reminds us that history often hinges on the unforeseen. A routine maneuver gone wrong, a trail left behind, and an enemy ready to pounce. This is just the beginning. The night of June 5, 1942, cloaked the Pacific in an impenetrable darkness. No moon lit the way. Heavy clouds smothered the stars. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's cruiser division, 7 Mikuma, Mogami, Suzuya, and Kumano, flanked by destroyers Arashio and Asashio, pushed westward at full steam. The order from Admiral Yamamoto had come through. Retreat. The loss of the carriers was a gut punch, but survival was now the priority. The ships zigzagged through the waves, engines roaring, to evade any lurking American submarines. On Mikuma's bridge, Captain Shakao Sakayama scanned the horizon with binoculars, his face etched with exhaustion. The crew, still reeling from the day's disasters, manned their stations in grim silence. Lookouts peered into the void, their eyes burning from strain. This was no orderly withdrawal. It was a desperate flight. Around 11:30 p.m., the destroyer Arashio spotted something, a shadowy silhouette on the water. It was the American submarine Tambor, lurking like a predator in the deep. Alerts blared across the formation. Mogami, leading the line just ahead of Mikuma, veered sharply to starboard to dodge potential torpedoes. In the chaos, her captain misjudged the turn. With a deafening crash that echoed across the sea, Mogami's bow slammed into Mikuma's port quarter. Metal screamed against metal. Sparks flew in the night. Mogami's prow crumpled like tinfoil, shearing off nearly 40 feet of her hull. On Mikuma, the impact ripped open her portside fuel tanks. Thousands of gallons of heavy fuel oil gushed into the ocean. The collision was no mere bump. It was catastrophic. Mikuma shuddered from stem to stern, her decks buckling under the force. Alarms wailed. Emergency lights flickered on. Crewmen were thrown from their feet, some suffering broken bones or concussions. In the engine rooms, engineers scrambled to assess the damage. The portside bunker had been torn wide, and oil poured out unchecked. Captain Sakayama, steadying himself on the bridge, barked orders to secure the area. Damage control parties rushed in with pumps and patches, but the gash was too large. Temporary seals, canvas, wood, even cement were slapped on, but they held for only so long. The oil slick began to form almost immediately. A dark, iridescent trail snaking behind the wounded cruiser. It stretched for miles, visible even in the dim light to any aircraft overhead. Mikuma's speed dropped dramatically. From her top 35 knots, she limped along at just 12, barely faster than a merchant ship. She became the weak link in the chain, forcing the entire division to slow down. Mogami fared even worse. Her bow gone, she could barely make headway. The two sisters, once proud hunters, were now crippled prey. In the aftermath, radio silence was broken briefly to report the incident to Kurita. The admiral, aboard Kumano, decided to press on. Destroyers Arashio and Asashio were detached to escort the damaged pair. The rest of the force sped ahead, leaving them vulnerable. This decision would prove fateful. Survivors' accounts paint a vivid picture of the panic below decks. One petty officer on Mikuma recalled the stench of fuel oil filling the air, seeping into compartments. Men coughed and retched as fumes spread. The fear was palpable, not just of sinking, but of fire. Oil on water burns fiercely, and any spark could ignite an inferno. Yet, discipline held. Japanese naval training emphasized stoicism. Complaints were rare. Captain Sakiyama, drawing on his experience from earlier campaigns, rallied his officers. He knew the oil trail was a beacon for the enemy. In a log entry recovered later from debris, he noted, "The leak cannot be fully stemmed. We proceed with caution, aware of the risk from above." Post-war analyses from the U.S. Naval War College highlight this moment as a classic example of how minor accidents amplify in war. The collision wasn't due to incompetence. It was the fog of war fatigue, poor visibility, and the pressure of pursuit. Tambor, the sub that triggered it all, didn't even fire. She just observed and reported, but her presence set off the chain reaction. The oil slick, that insidious trail, was the real killer. In daylight, it would glisten like a road map, leading straight to the stragglers. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the group limped on. Suzuya and Kumano were now far ahead, out of sight. Mikuma and Mogami, with their destroyer escorts, formed a ragged quartet. The sea was calm, almost mocking in its tranquility, but tension built like a storm on the horizon. Crewmen on watch strained to hear the drone of engines, American planes, perhaps from the carriers that had decimated their own. Intelligence reports had warned of Enterprise and Hornet still operational. If they launched scouts, the oil would give them away. One can imagine the whispers among the sailors. Will we make it to the submarine screen? To home waters? For many, home was a distant dream now. The Imperial Navy's code of Bushido demanded they fight on, but doubt crept in. This was the turning point. What started as a tactical retreat was morphing into a survival ordeal. The wound from the collision wasn't fatal yet, but it exposed Mikuma to the elements, to the enemy. In the vast Pacific, where distances are measured in days, a 12-knot speed was a death sentence. American aviators, fueled by victory, were eager for more. As June 6 broke, the first light revealed the slick in all its damning glory. It stretched back eastward, a black ribbon on blue water. From 10,000 feet, it would be unmissable. Pilots from Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, were already airborne. Scout planes fanned out, searching for stragglers. One VB-6 Dauntless from Enterprise spotted it first. The report crackled back. Oil trails sighted. Following to source, the noose tightened. Mikuma's anti-aircraft gunners checked their weapons. Ammunition was loaded. Eyes turned skyward. Captain Sakiyama prepared for the worst. He didn't know it yet, but the skies were about to unleash hell. The oil had betrayed them. What followed was a barrage that would test the limits of human endurance. But that's for the next chapter. For now, picture those ships, wounded and alone, steaming into an uncertain dawn. The collision had sealed their isolation. The slick had signed their warrant. In war, it's often the small things, the overlooked leak, the midnight mishap that write the epitaphs. Mikuma's story is a reminder. Victory at Midway wasn't just about the carriers. It was about the relentless pursuit that followed. The Americans weren't done. Far from it. They were coming. Wings spread wide, bombs ready, and Mikuma, trailing her fatal signature, had nowhere to hide. As the first rays of dawn pierced the eastern horizon on June 6, 1942. The Pacific Ocean awoke to a deceptive calm. The oil slick from Mikuma's ruptured tanks shimmered under the early light, a treacherous ribbon stretching miles behind her. It was a dead giveaway, a natural flare, signaling vulnerability to any eyes in the sky. Aboard the American carrier Enterprise, part of Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, scout planes had taken off at first light. These SBD Dauntless dive bombers, piloted by battle-tested airmen from Bombing Squadron 6, fanned out in search patterns. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the air group, had orders to hunt down stragglers from the retreating Japanese fleet. Around 8 a.m., one scout spotted the telltale trail. The radio crackled to life. Oil slick sighted, leading to enemy cruisers. Coordinates follow. Word spread like wildfire through the American carriers. Hornets squadrons joined in. In total, 81 aircraft would converge dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. This wasn't a hasty strike. It was methodical vengeance. Back on Mikuma, the morning watch had just changed. Sailors sipped weak tea, trying to shake off the night's ordeal. The air reeked of fuel. Decks were slick with residue. Captain Shikao Sakiyama, nursing bruises from the collision, conferred with his executive officer, Commander Takashima. They knew the risk. Daylight meant exposure. Anti-aircraft crews stood ready at their 3-inch guns and machine guns. Lookouts scanned the skies. Then, the dreaded sound, a low hum growing into a roar. "Enemy planes inbound!" shouted a spotter. Alarms blared. Men raced to battle stations. The first wave hit around 10 a.m. 31 Dauntlesses from Enterprise. They circled high, out of flak range, then peeled off in steep dives. Whistles pierced the air as bombs plummeted. Mikuma's gunners opened up, tracers arcing skyward. But the Americans were precise. The lead bomb struck amidships, detonating near turret number 3. Shrapnel flew. Flames erupted from the gun mount. Dozens of crewmen were cut down instantly. A second hit the bridge wing, wounding Sakiyama in the leg and arm. Blood splattered the charts. He collapsed but refused evacuation. "Keep fighting!" he gasped, directing from a stretcher. The attack lasted minutes, but felt eternal. Mogami, nearby, took hits too, her decks ablaze. Destroyers Arashio and Asashio maneuvered frantically, laying smoke screens. But the oil on the water ignited in places, turning the sea into patches of fire. Wounded sailors screamed. Medics worked amid chaos. This was just the opener. The Japanese fought back fiercely. Mikuma's remaining guns barked, downing at least one attacker. But the Dauntlesses were relentless, designed for this punishing role. By noon, a brief lull. Damage reports flooded in. Engineering spaces flooded. Speed further reduced. Fires raged below decks. Pumps strained against the influx. Crewmen formed bucket brigades, passing seawater hand to hand. The heat was infernal. Smoke choked the air. One engineer recalled later, "It was like breathing fire. We thought the ship would explode any second." Yet, morale held barely. Officers invoked the spirit of the samurai, urging men to their posts. Takashima took temporary command, his voice steady over the intercom. But the Americans weren't finished. Around 1 p.m., the second wave arrived, more Dauntlesses from Hornet, joined by torpedo bombers. 26 planes this time. They came in low and high, a coordinated assault. Torpedoes skimmed the water. Bombs rained down. Mikuma twisted and turned, but her wounds slowed her. A torpedo struck portside. Below the waterline, water gushed in. Compartments flooded rapidly. Then, a bomb penetrated the engine room, igniting fuel lines. Explosions rippled through the hull. The third turret's magazine detonated in a massive blast. Flames shot skyward, Debris rained down. Over 100 men perished in that instant, vaporized or crushed. The ship listed heavily to port, her superstructure mangled. Horatio pulled alongside, taking off survivors amid the barrage. But many stayed, manning guns until the end. The final wave struck at 1:58 p.m. Another 24 aircraft, pounding the cripples. Mikuma took at least 5 more bombs and 2 torpedoes. Her torpedo tubes, armed with long lances, cooked off in a chain reaction. Half the stern vanished in a fireball. The mainmast toppled, radio antennas sparked and fell. By now, she was a floating pyre, flames licking every deck. Sailors, faces blackened with soot, fired whatever weapons remained. One machine gunner kept shooting until his position was engulfed. American pilots, circling for confirmation, reported. Cruiser burning fiercely, dead in the water. Mogami, though battered, managed to limp away with help, but Mikuma was doomed. As the attacks subsided around 3 p.m., the full horror unfolded. Hundreds wounded. Bodies littered the decks. The list worsened 30 degrees. Then 40. Abandon ship, came the order from Takashima. Men jumped into the oily sea, some aflame. The water burned around them, screams echoed. Life rafts were scarce. Many clung to wreckage. Destroyers circled, picking up whom they could. But in the confusion, some were left behind. Survivor testimonies, collected post-war by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, reveal the human cost. One Mikuma sailor described, "The bombs came like thunderbolts. Friends vanished before my eyes. I swam through fire, thinking of my family." Another, Captain Sakayama, bandaged and pale, saluted us as we left. He knew his end. Indeed, Sakayama stayed aboard, too injured to swim. Takashima joined him, choosing death over capture, a final act of honor. In Japanese tradition, this was seppuku at sea. Though no blade was needed, the ship would suffice. American records from the after-action reports praise the Japanese defense. "Tenacious AA fire," noted one pilot. They didn't quit, but superiority in the air was overwhelming. Spruance's decision to pursue was bold, risking his carriers but sealing the victory. Midway's air power shift was evident here, carriers projecting force hundreds of miles away. For the Japanese, this attack exposed flaws, poor damage control compared to U.S. standards, and over-reliance on speed that failed when crippled. The oil slick, that silent traitor, had enabled it all. Without it, Mikuma might have slipped away in the vast ocean. Instead, she became a target. As the sun dipped lower, the cruiser groaned, her hull twisting. Fires consumed what remained. At dusk, she rolled over, stern first, vanishing beneath the waves at coordinates 29 degrees 20 minutes north, 173 degrees 30 minutes east. Bubbles and debris marked her grave. But for the survivors temporarily safe on the destroyers, the ordeal continued. 240 were rescued initially, but many succumbed to wounds. Sakayama died 3 days later aboard a Sashio. 2 sailors, adrift on a raft, were picked up by an American submarine after enduring sharks and sun. Their interrogation provided valuable intel. This wasn't the end of the story. The sinking of Mikuma rippled far beyond. She was the first heavy cruiser Japan lost in the war, a harbinger of attrition to come. For the men who fought through those hellish hours, it was a testament to endurance. But as night fell on June 6, the sea claimed its due. What became of the rest? The legacy of this forgotten victim of Midway awaits in our final chapter. Stay tuned. As twilight descended on June 6, 1942, the Pacific turned a somber hue. Mikuma, once a sleek predator of the seas, now wallowed like a dying beast. Her hull groaned under the weight of fires and floods. The list to port had reached critical 50 degrees and worsening. Flames danced across her decks, consuming ammunition lockers and living quarters alike. Black smoke billowed into the evening sky, a funeral pyre visible for miles. Survivors clung to rails, faces grim with soot and despair. The order to abandon ship echoed through the inferno. Men leaped into the churning waters below. But this was no clean escape. The sea around her burned patches of oil ignited by sparks, turning the ocean into a hellish cauldron. Screams pierced the dusk as sailors swam through flames, their skin blistering. Some made it to rafts. Others grabbed floating debris hats, wood planks, empty shell casings. The destroyers Arashio and Asashio circled bravely, lowering nets and lines. Crewmen hauled the exhausted aboard. One by one, Mogami, herself damaged but afloat, took on as many as she could. Initial counts, 240 from Mikuma pulled from the waves, but many were gravely injured: burns, shrapnel wounds, smoke inhalation. Medics worked frantically with limited supplies, prioritizing the officers. Captain Shikao Sakiyama was among them, lifted onto Asashio's deck, his body mangled from bomb fragments. He lingered in agony for 3 days, whispering final orders before slipping away on June 9. His death was a quiet one, far from the glory he once sought. Executive Officer Takashima chose a different path. As the ship foundered, he remained on the bridge. In the tradition of the Imperial Navy, he would not abandon his post. Survivors later spoke of seeing him salute the flag one last time. Whether by blade or by the sea's embrace, he went down with her, a deliberate act of honor. This was Bushido in its rawest form, loyalty unto death. The final plunge came at sunset. Mikuma rolled fully to port, her bow lifting briefly before submerging. Bubbles erupted. A whirlpool formed. She vanished stern first into the depths at 29 degrees, 20 minutes north, 173 degrees, 30 minutes east. The ocean swallowed her whole, leaving oil slicks and wreckage as her only tombstone. 2 sailors, separated from the group, drifted on a makeshift raft. For 3 harrowing days, they battled thirst, sharks, and exposure. Miraculously, the American submarine Trout surfaced nearby. Her crew, spotting the castaways, hauled them aboard. These men, petty officers whose names were redacted in reports, provided interrogators with details of the battle. Their accounts filled gaps in U.S. intelligence, confirming the extent of Japanese losses. Back home, the Imperial Navy downplayed the disaster. Official reports listed Mikuma as lost in action, with scant details. But the human toll was staggering. Of her 900 crew, only 188 survived long-term. The rest, over 700, perished in the attacks or the sea. Families received telegrams of regret, their loved ones enshrined as heroes at Yasukuni. Post-war inquiries revealed more. The U.S. Navy's official history noted, Mikuma was the first enemy heavy cruiser sunk by air attack alone in the war. This marked a shift air power's dominance over surface ships. For Japan, it was a harbinger. Midway cost them not just carriers, but confidence. The attrition began. Cruisers like Mikuma were irreplaceable, with shipyards strained by Allied bombings. Her class, the Mogamis, saw sisters fall one by one. Mogami at Leyte Gulf, Suzuya there too, Kumano torpedoed later. Mikuma's sinking taught harsh lessons. That oil slick underscored how minor oversights amplify in combat. A patched tank might have saved her, better night maneuvers could have prevented the collision. American after-action reviews praised their pilots' precision but critiqued Japanese damage control. U.S. ships used CO, 2 systems and foam. Japanese relied on water, which spread fires in oily environments. This gap widened as the war progressed. Today, Mikuma rests in over 5,000 feet of water. Expeditions by the research vessel Petrel in 2019 located her wreck. Sonar images show her upside down, broken in 2 bow and stern separated. Marine life encrusts her guns. Coral claims her hull. Artifacts recovered include portholes and bells, now in museums like the Yamato Museum in Kure. Her story lives in archives. The Naval Historical Center in Washington holds pilot logs. Tokyo's war records detail survivor testimonies, one poignant account from a rescued gunner. As she sank, the sun set with her. It felt like the end of our empire's dawn. Indeed, Midway was the turning point. Japan's offensive halted. America seized the initiative, island hopping toward Tokyo. Mikuma, though a footnote in many histories, embodies the personal tragedies behind grand strategies. She wasn't at the battle's heart like the carriers, but her fate sealed the retreat's misery. Imagine those final moments. The sea claiming steel and souls alike. The oil that doomed her, a poetic irony, fuel for her engines turned traitor. In the annals of naval warfare, she reminds us, wars are won not just by bold strokes, but by the accumulation of small failures. The collision, the slick, the bombs, all threads in a tapestry of defeat. As we close this chapter, reflect on the men of Mikuma, sailors from farms and cities, bound by duty, lost to the deep. Their sacrifice echoes through time. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the forgotten corners of Midway. If this tale of a single oil slick and its deadly consequences sparked your curiosity, share it with others. Subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.
June 4th, 1942. 10:22 in the morning. Three of the most powerful aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy are on fire. Aboard the Akagi, Japan's flagship, the pride of their fleet, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo receives the reports one after another. Akagi, hit. Kaga, hit. Soryu, hit. In the span of a few minutes, three of Japan's four carriers have been dealt a fatal blow. The fourth, the Hiryu, is still out there. She is already preparing her counterstrike. But Nagumo, standing among the reports, is not thinking about the Hiryu. He doesn't understand what just happened to the other three. And he doesn't understand why. Not because he lacked information, not because the Americans had prepared better than he expected, but because of a single sentence written in the dark hours of that same morning, before a single shot had been fired, that no one on his staff had ever questioned. After the war, that sentence appeared in Japan's internal battle records. Then someone removed it. One of Nagumo's own officers, the man responsible for compiling the official report of the battle, quietly left it out. He never told the historians. He never told the authors of Japan's official war history series. He carried that omission for 70 years. And then, in 2012, at the end of his life, he finally told a Japanese historian what he had done. According to the Naval War College Review, published by the United States Naval War College, what that sentence contained was the real reason Japan lost the Battle of Midway. We're going to read that sentence today, but first, we need to talk about the man who wrote the version of Midway that you already know, and why even Japan's own historians stopped trusting him decades ago. Here is something most people don't realize. Everything the Western world knows about what happened on the Japanese side at Midway, every book, every documentary, every film, every YouTube video you've ever watched on the subject, traces back to a single source. One man. His name was Mitsuo Fuchida. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Fuchida was the senior air officer who led the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He was present on the Akagi during the Battle of Midway, and when the war ended, he was one of the very few senior officers who had been at the center of both attacks and survived to write about them. In 1955, he published a book, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan. It was translated into English almost immediately. American publishers promoted it. American historians cited it. The 1976 film, Midway, the one with Henry Fonda and Hal Holbrook, drew heavily from his account. For the better part of 5 decades, if you were an American trying to understand what happened on the Japanese side of that battle, Fuchida was your primary source. Most people who've written about Midway in English have built on his account, whether they knew it or not. Now step back for a moment. In 1971, 16 years after Fuchida's book came out, Japan released something called the Senshi Sosho, 102 volumes. It was Japan's official military history of the war, compiled by the Japanese government from internal documents, operational records, and materials that had never been made public. Volume 43 covered the Battle of Midway. It was not translated into English. For decades, 2 versions of the same battle existed side by side. The one Americans were reading, and the one Japan's own historians had produced from their own classified records. They were not the same. Jonathan Parshall spent the better part of 10 years working through Japanese primary sources, documents that had never been used by Western historians writing about the Pacific War. In 2005, he and Anthony Tully published Shattered Sword through the Naval Institute Press. And then, in the spring 2010 edition of the Naval War College Review, the academic journal of the institution that trains America's admirals, Parshall wrote something that is worth reading carefully. He wrote, "Fuchida's impact on the history of the Pacific War has been enormously damaging, in that his elaborations have been parroted for years and handed down as truth on the big screen, on television, and in countless internet chat rooms. That is not a casual opinion from a blogger. That is a trained historian, writing in a peer-reviewed military journal, making a direct and documented case that the foundational account of Midway that Americans have accepted for half a century does not hold up against the Japanese records that actually survived the war. Now, why would Fuchida write something that didn't match Japan's own official documents? Consider the circumstances. He published in 1955. Japan had surrendered 10 years earlier. The Imperial Japanese Navy, an institution that had existed for 70 years, the source of enormous national pride, had been dissolved. The men who served in it had lost. Fuchida wasn't just writing history. He was writing for an audience that had suffered one of the most devastating national humiliations in modern memory. Parshall put it plainly in his research. The goal, he wrote, was to find some sense of national pride that might be regained by revealing some moments of nobility within that defeat. That is not a condemnation. That is a human explanation for why a man shapes a story the way he needs it to be shaped. But the consequence has been that for decades, every American who thought they understood what happened on the Japanese side of Midway was reading a version of events that Japan's own scholars had long since set aside. There is a Japanese official history of the Battle of Midway that most Americans have never had access to. There are internal records, message logs, battle reports compiled in the immediate aftermath of the fighting, documents that tell a different story than the one Fuchida wanted the world to hear. And buried inside one of those documents, in a message log compiled on the morning of June 4th, before the first American bomb fell, is the sentence that was quietly removed, the sentence that one officer carried in silence for 70 years. That's where we're going next. If this is the first time you've heard any of this, you're probably not the only one. If you think someone else should know this story exists, A-like takes about 1 second and puts it in front of people who've never seen it. 8 days before the battle. May 27th, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton walks into Admiral Chester Nimitz's office at Pearl Harbor and sets a piece of paper on the desk. On it, he has written the following: "The Japanese carriers will attack on the morning of June 4th. They will approach from the northwest, on a bearing of 325 degrees. They will be approximately 175 miles from Midway at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's it. Date, direction, distance, time. Nimitz reads it. He doesn't ask for a second opinion. He doesn't wait for Washington to confirm it. He doesn't hedge. He deploys his entire available carrier force, all 3 ships, including the USS Yorktown, which had taken serious damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea less than a month earlier and had been estimated to need 3 months of repairs. Nimitz told the repair crews at Pearl Harbor they had 3 days. They gave him 72 hours. The Yorktown steamed out of dry dock and headed north to meet the Japanese fleet. On the morning of June 4th, as the first American scout reports began coming in, Nimitz turned to Leighton and said, "Well, you were only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off. 5 miles, 5 degrees, 5 minutes, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now, how does something like that happen? It doesn't happen by accident. It happens because of a deliberate choice Nimitz made about how he wanted to receive information. The Naval History and Heritage Command, the United States Navy's own historical authority, recorded what Nimitz told Leighton when he first took command of the Pacific Fleet, in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. He told Leighton that his job was to think like Admiral Yamamoto, not to brief Nimitz on what was happening, not to summarize intercepts, not to tell him what the intelligence said, to think like the enemy commander, to get inside his head and tell Nimitz what Yamamoto was going to do next, even when the evidence was incomplete, even when Washington disagreed, even when being wrong would mean career consequences for everyone in the room. That is a very specific thing to ask of an intelligence officer. It means the job is not to confirm. It means the job is to challenge. And Nimitz built his entire pre-battle planning around that principle. According to Proceedings, the flagship journal of the United States Naval Institute, Nimitz and his staff did not simply accept intelligence estimates at face value. They made a deliberate effort to understand the tradecraft behind the estimates they were receiving. Washington, at that same moment, was telling Nimitz he was wrong. The army on Oahu believed the Japanese were coming back to hit Pearl Harbor again. Naval intelligence in Washington thought the attack would fall somewhere in the South Pacific, possibly Australia, possibly the Aleutians. Nimitz listened to all of it. And then he trusted the 2 men who had spent years living in Japan, learning the language, studying the culture, and reading Yamamoto's communications with their own eyes. Rochefort and Leighton, not because they told him what he wanted to hear, because he understood exactly how they had reached their conclusions. There is one more thing worth knowing about how Nimitz operated. In the spring of 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort, the head of Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, came to Nimitz with an unusual proposal. The Americans were almost certain that the Japanese target was Midway Island, referred to in Japanese communications only by the code letters AF. Almost certain, but not certain enough. Rochefort proposed a test. He would have the garrison at Midway broadcast an unencrypted message, completely open for anyone to hear, reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. If the Japanese were planning to hit Midway, their communications would almost certainly reference the water shortage. Nimitz approved it. Within hours, American listening stations intercepted a Japanese transmission reporting that their target, the location designated AF, was running low on fresh water. The identity of the Japanese objective was no longer almost certain. It was confirmed. What Rochefort proposed was a trap built out of information. What Nimitz did was say yes, when a less confident commander might have said, "That's too clever, too risky, too unorthodox." Keep that word in mind. Unorthodox, because on the other side of the Pacific, At almost exactly the same moment, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. And the men in that room were not in the habit of saying yes to ideas that challenged the plan. We need to go back to the beginning of June 4th, not 10:22 in the morning, when the bombs were already falling. Earlier, much earlier, 5:20 in the morning, local time. The Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force, is steaming toward Midway in the darkness. The first wave of aircraft has already been launched to attack the island. On the bridge of the Akagi, Air Staff Officer Yoshioka Tadakazu is compiling the morning's operational log. He records the weather, wind speed, sea state, visibility, the bearing and speed of the fleet, standard entries. And then, before moving on, he writes one more line, a single sentence recording the staff's intelligence estimate for the day ahead. The sentence read, "It is calculated that the enemy Kido Butai will not be encountered today." The enemy carrier force will not be encountered today. That was the official assessment of Nagumo's staff at 5:20 in the morning on June 4th, 1942. Less than 5 hours later, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were gone. Now, here is what that sentence is not. It is not a tactical error. It is not a failure of nerve. It is not a decision made under pressure by a man who should have known better. It is something quieter than that, and more consequential. According to the Naval War College Review, Spring 2015, published by the United States Naval War College, that sentence is evidence of something that shaped everything that followed on June 4th. The journal's authors wrote, Nagumo and his staff did not expect, and therefore did not even prepare for, contact with an enemy carrier force on the morning of June 4th. Everything that followed flows from this faulty estimate of the situation. Everything that followed. The rearming of the aircraft, the delays, the confusion on the flight decks, the 40 minutes of indecision that everyone has spent 80 years arguing about. All of it flows from one thing, a staff that went into battle without ever genuinely asking whether American carriers might be waiting for them. Not because the question was impossible, because the question was never asked. Think about what Leighton was doing at roughly the same hour on the other side of the Pacific. He was sitting with his charts and his intercepts, building a picture of exactly where the Japanese fleet would be, when it would arrive, and what it would do. He had been asked to think like the enemy. On the Akagi, no one had been asked to think like the Americans. The assessment was not a prediction. It was an assumption. And assumptions, unlike predictions, do not require evidence. They only require confidence. Now we come to the second part of this story. The sentence Yoshioka wrote that morning was included in the raw message log. After the battle, when Yoshioka was assigned the task of compiling the official post-battle report, what historians have since called the Nagumo Report, he made a decision. He left that sentence out. He did not misplace it. He did not forget it. He removed it. The official report that went up the chain of command, the report that would become part of the permanent record of the Imperial Japanese Navy, did not contain the line that said the staff had not expected to find American carriers that morning. And then, decades later, when Japan was compiling its official war history, the Senshi Sosho, the 102-volume series drawn from internal military records, Yoshioka did not tell the historians about it then either. According to the Naval War College Review, the omission was not even disclosed to the writers of the Senshi Sosho. The official history of the war did not know the sentence existed. Yoshioka kept it to himself for 70 years. In 2012, a Japanese historian named Mori Shiro published a book called Midway Kaitsen, Naval Battle of Midway. It contained interviews with surviving participants, some of them released only after the subjects had died. One of the most significant was with Yoshioka himself. In that interview, Yoshioka admitted what he had done. He acknowledged the omission, and he told Mori why. He said he had removed it, in his own words, to protect the Navy's reputation. The Naval War College Review, analyzing his admission, was direct about what the deletion meant, that there had been, among a select group of surviving officers, an understanding about how the defeat at Midway was to be presented to history. The mental unreadiness of the Kido Butai for encountering an American carrier force on the morning of June 4th. That was to be downplayed, suppressed if possible. Instead, the story that would be told was one of misfortune and timing, bad luck, narrow margins, the fog of war, not an assumption that was never challenged, not a staff that went to battle having already decided the Americans wouldn't be there. It is worth pausing here to consider what Yoshioka was actually protecting. By 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had existed as an institution for 70 years. It had won at Tsushima in 1905. It had surprised the world at Pearl Harbor. Its officers were trained from childhood to believe that the Navy represented something larger than any individual battle. Yoshioka was not protecting himself. He was protecting that. That is not an excuse. It is a fact. And it explains something about why the sentence stayed missing for as long as it did. There is one more layer to this. Japan's own official war history, the Senshi Sosho, Volume 43, contains a finding that sits quietly alongside everything else we've discussed. It concerns the mechanics of what would have had to happen on the Japanese carriers for Nagumo to mount any kind of response, even if he had received a warning in time. The Senshi Sosho states that the procedure for bringing aircraft up from the hangars, positioning them on the flight deck, arming them, fueling them, and preparing them for launch would have taken, at minimum, 40 minutes. 40 minutes, even if Nagumo had known, even if the question had been asked, even if someone on his staff had looked at the intelligence that morning and said, "Wait." The carriers couldn't have responded in time, which means the problem was not just one sentence in a morning log. It was a system, built entirely around the assumption that surprise would always belong to Japan. A system with no contingency for the morning it didn't. Now consider the 40 minutes of decisions that everyone has spent decades arguing about. Between 7:15 and roughly 8 o'clock that morning, Nagumo received 3 separate pieces of contradictory information in less than an hour. At 7:15, he ordered his reserve aircraft to swap their torpedoes for land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. His scout planes had reported no American ships in the area. At 7:28, one of his scout planes reported 10 enemy surface ships to the northeast. No carriers mentioned. Nagumo halted the rearming. At 7:45, a follow-up report. One of the ships appeared to be a carrier. Now his flight decks were covered with aircraft in mid-rearm, some with bombs, some with torpedoes, fuel lines running across the deck, ordnance stacked in the open. And his first strike wave was already returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land. The Naval War College Review, the same 2015 analysis that identified the deleted sentence, makes a point that is easy to miss in the decades of criticism directed at Nagumo. It states that his decisions, given the information he had at each moment, were not unreasonable. Each individual choice, viewed in isolation, had a logic to it. The problem was not that Nagumo made bad decisions under pressure. The problem was that he was making decisions inside a situation that his own staff's morning assessment had told him would never exist. He was improvising inside a scenario that his command had already concluded was impossible. The sentence that said the American carriers would not be encountered today, that sentence set the frame for everything. It was written at 5:20 in the morning, removed from the record after the battle, hidden from Japan's own historians for 3 decades, and according to the officer who removed it, speaking at the end of his life, to a historian who was willing to listen, it was the real reason Japan lost the Battle of Midway. The question worth asking is this: where did that assumption come from? The one written into the morning log. The one that said the Americans wouldn't be there. It didn't appear on June 4th. It was built, carefully, methodically, 5 weeks earlier. May 1st through May 4th, 1942. Aboard the battleship Yamato, anchored at Hashirajima, the most powerful warship ever constructed, Yamamoto's personal flagship, the senior commanders of the Imperial Japanese Navy gathered for a tabletop war game. The formal purpose was to stress-test the Midway plan before committing the fleet to it. Find the weaknesses, challenge the assumptions, work out what could go wrong. That was the purpose. What actually happened was something different. On the second day of the exercise, the officer commanding the simulated American forces sent a flight of land-based bombers from Midway Island to attack the Japanese carrier group. The dice were thrown. The result: 9 hits on the Japanese carriers. By the rules of the exercise, that meant 2 carriers were sunk. Akagi and Kaga, the same 2 carriers that would lead the actual attack, were ruled destroyed. The chief umpire of the exercise was Rear Admiral Ugaki Matome, Yamamoto's own chief of staff. Ugaki looked at the result, and then he set it aside. He reduced the number of hits from 9 to 3. Under his revised ruling, Kaga was still sunk. But Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, the ship where Yoshioka would sit down 5 weeks later to write his morning log, Akagi survived. The exercise continued. Later, in the portion of the game covering the operations that would follow Midway, even Kaga quietly reappeared, restored to the Japanese order of battle, as if her earlier sinking had never occurred. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, in Shattered Sword, described the 4 days of exercises as a mockery of professional staff work. The Naval History and Heritage Command, the official historical authority of the United States Navy, recorded what happened when the American player attempted something more realistic. At one point during the exercise, the officer playing the American side positioned his carriers to the north of Midway and launched a strike from an unexpected angle. The attack worked. It worked the same way the real American attack would work, 5 weeks later, in almost exactly the same location. The Naval History and Heritage Command noted that his actions were ruled impossible by the umpire, and the Japanese game losses were restored. His name is not recorded in any document that has survived the war. He played the Americans correctly. He was told that wasn't how the Americans would fight, and the planning session moved on. There was one more moment worth knowing about. During the planning meetings that accompanied the exercise, Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutak, commander of the Second Fleet, one of the most senior officers present, asked a direct question. If Japan captured Midway, how would the island be resupplied? The atoll was more than 1,000 miles from the nearest major Japanese base. Keeping it supplied would require a sustained logistical effort that the Navy had not fully planned for. Yamamoto's own chief of staff acknowledged that resupply might not be possible. The question hung in the air for a moment. No one pursued it. Vice Admiral Nagumo, who would command the carrier strike force, said nothing. He had reason to stay quiet. Yamamoto had criticized him sharply for not ordering a third strike at Pearl Harbor, for pulling back when Yamamoto believed he should have pressed. The relationship between the two men was strained. Nagumo was not in a position to challenge the plan. The meeting ended. The plan was approved as written. Kondo's question and the Chief of Staff's answer did not appear in the meeting record. Now hold that image. A planning session aboard the most powerful ship in the world. A war game where unfavorable results were revised until they came out right. An officer who played the Americans correctly and was told his moves were impossible. A direct question about a fatal flaw in the plan that was acknowledged, then dropped, then left out of the record. And then come back to Pearl Harbor. Same weeks, same month, different room. Nimitz is telling Leighton that his job, his only job, is to think like the enemy, not to confirm, to challenge. Rochefort is in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, working through intercepts, and coming to Nimitz with ideas that sound, on their face, unorthodox, like sending a fake message about broken water equipment to trap the Japanese into revealing their own target. And Nimitz is saying yes. There are no umpires overruling the results in the basement of Station Hypo. There is no senior officer adjusting the dice rolls until the outcome matches the plan. The two rooms are not that far apart in time. They are separated by an ocean, and by something harder to measure. On the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey is flying at 20,000 feet over an empty stretch of the Pacific Ocean. He is the air group commander of the USS Enterprise. He has been in the air for nearly 2 hours. His fuel is running low. The Japanese fleet is not where it was supposed to be. Nagumo had changed course that morning, the result of evasive maneuvering under repeated American attacks from Midway, and the Kido Butai was no longer where it was expected to be. McCluskey reaches the estimated point of interception and finds nothing. He has no updated position report, no new orders from the Enterprise, no way to know where the Japanese have gone. He has a decision to make. He could turn back. His fuel situation was becoming critical. Every minute of additional searching increased the risk that he and his pilots would run dry before they could land. He chose to keep searching. He extended his flight to the southwest, then turned north, a calculated guess about where the Japanese carriers might have gone. 20 minutes later, he saw something below him. A single Japanese destroyer, steaming at full speed toward the northeast. The ship was the Arashi. She had spent the morning attacking the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had been harassing the Japanese fleet, and was now racing to rejoin the main formation. McCluskey watched her bow cut through the water, pointing like an arrow. He followed it. At 10 o'clock in the morning, he spotted the wakes of the Japanese carriers. 22 minutes later, at 10:22, his dive bombers rolled into their attack runs. Nimitz later described McCluskey's decision, the choice to keep searching, to extend the flight, to follow the destroyer, as having decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at a Midway. That is not a small thing to say about one man's choice on a morning when everything was uncertain. McCluskey had no orders for that situation. No one had told him what to do if the Japanese weren't where they were supposed to be. He made a judgment call. And it worked. That afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise located the Hiryu and left her burning without the ability to launch aircraft. She was scuttled the following morning. By June 5th, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. What happened next is less often told. Before the surviving Japanese ships had even returned to port at Hashirajima, before the fleet had anchored on June 14th, senior Navy officers were already discussing how the battle would be presented. Jonathan Parshall, writing in Naval History magazine in 2007, documented what followed. The official announcement to the Japanese public described Midway as a victory. 2 American carriers had been sunk, it said. Japan had prevailed. The Akagi and the Hiryu, both at the bottom of the Pacific, were kept on the Navy's official roster, listed not as sunk, listed as unmanned. Sailors who had been wounded at Midway were separated from the general hospital population. They were not allowed to communicate with their families. They were not permitted to tell anyone what had happened. Not a single admiral was relieved of command. Not Yamamoto. Not Nagumo. The institution closed around the defeat the way water closes around a stone, and Yoshioka, sitting down sometime after the battle to compile the official report, made his own small contribution to that effort. He removed a sentence. One sentence, the one that would have shown, in the Navy's own words, written by one of its own officers, at 5:20 in the morning before a single shot had been fired, that the staff of the Kido Butai had already decided the Americans wouldn't be there. On the morning of June 4th, as the first scout reports confirmed that the Japanese fleet was exactly where Leighton said it would be, Nimitz turned to his intelligence officer and said, "Well, you were only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off." Leighton had told him the fleet would be 175 miles from Midway. It was 180. He had said bearing 325 degrees. It was 320. He had said 7 o'clock in the morning. It was 5 minutes past. 5 miles. 5 degrees. 5 minutes. In the middle of an ocean that covers a third of the Earth's surface. That is what it looks like when an institution builds a system designed to find the truth. Even when the truth is inconvenient. Even when Washington disagrees. Even when the answer changes the plan entirely. On the other side of that ocean, an institution built a system designed to protect the plan, even when the war game said it would fail, even when an officer asked a question that had no comfortable answer, even when the morning log recorded an assumption that the enemy would simply not appear. The assumption was wrong, and the man who wrote it down spent the rest of his life making sure no one would know. Yoshioka kept quiet for 70 years. A lot of the men who were actually there did the same thing. If someone in your family served in the Pacific, what did they tell you about it? Or what did they never talk about? Those silences say something too. Leave it in the comments. I'm asking because I genuinely want to know.
September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. On the deck of the USS Missouri, the most powerful navy in the world is watching. General Douglas MacArthur steps to the microphone. Behind him, standing at attention, is a man who looks like he just walked out of a grave. His uniform hangs off his shoulders. His cheeks are hollow. His eyes are sunk deep into his face. But he is standing, straight, still. His name is Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright. And in a few minutes, he is going to watch the Japanese sign their unconditional surrender. 3 years earlier, this same man was the one holding the white flag. The newspapers called him the general who lost the Philippines, the largest surrender of American forces in history. Some people called him a failure. Some called him worse. But here he is, standing on the deck of the Missouri, watching Japan fold. How does a man go from the lowest moment in American military history to standing in that spot, on that deck, on that day? That answer begins not on a battleship. It begins in a jungle, on a peninsula called Bataan, where 80,000 men were starving, sick, and completely cut off, and one general refused to leave them. To understand what Wainwright faced, you have to understand what December 1941 looked like on the ground in the Philippines. It looked like the end of the world. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers hit Clark Field, the main American air base on the island of Luzon. Most of the B-17S never got off the ground. They were caught on the runway, lined up in neat rows, fully fueled. In one afternoon, MacArthur lost half his Air Force. Just like that. Gone. Then came the ships. On December 22nd, Japanese General Masaharu Homma put 43,000 combat troops ashore at Lingayen Gulf. 80 warships behind them, more men, more guns, more of everything. MacArthur's defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and now without air cover. MacArthur ordered a retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. The plan was to dig in, hold the line, and wait for reinforcements from the United States. The men believed the ships were coming. They had to believe that. It was the only thing that made any of it make sense. But there was a man in Washington who already knew the truth. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall understood the cold mathematics of a two-front war. Europe first. The Pacific could wait. The Philippines, and the 80,000 men now crowded onto Bataan, were expendable. No one told the men on the ground. Into this situation stepped Major General Jonathan Wainwright, a West Point cavalryman, class of 1906. Lean, leathery, built like a fence post. His men called him Skinny, not as an insult, but as a kind of affection. He was one of them. While MacArthur directed operations from inside the fortified tunnels of Corregidor Island, Wainwright was a front-line commander. He walked the defensive positions before sunrise. He sat in the dirt with men who hadn't eaten a real meal in weeks. One of his officers later said, "You always knew where Wainwright was. He was wherever it was worst." The men of Bataan were already on half rations by the first week of January, not because of poor planning on their part, but because MacArthur, in the chaos of the retreat, had left enormous stockpiles of rice and supplies behind on the wrong side of the Japanese line, tons of food, just sitting there, out of reach. So they made do. They ate what the jungle gave them: monkey, snake, iguana. The cavalry horses, animals these men had trained with, ridden with, cared for, were slaughtered for meat, and they kept fighting, because they believed the ships were coming. Jonathan Wainwright looked at these men every day. He knew what was happening to their bodies. He knew what Washington had decided, and he made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He was going to stay. He was going to fight. And he was not going to leave a single one of them behind. By February 1942, the men on Bataan had been at it for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of jungle heat, 6 weeks of one meal a day, 6 weeks of watching a horizon that stayed empty. Then the radio started. Every night, Japanese broadcasters aimed their signal directly at the men on Bataan, and they played a song. The title said everything. "I'm waiting for ships that never come in." Night after night. The same song. A reminder, delivered with a smile, that no one was coming. The men didn't talk about it much, but they knew. Then came March 11th. That evening, MacArthur's chief of staff summoned Wainwright to Corregidor. He told him quietly that MacArthur was leaving. That night, by patrol torpedo boat. President Roosevelt had ordered it personally. MacArthur was needed in Australia to lead the counteroffensive across the Pacific. The Philippines, and everyone on them, would have to hold on alone. MacArthur found Wainwright before he left. The two men stood together in the dim light of the Malinta Tunnel. "Goodbye, Jonathan," MacArthur said. "When I get back, if you're still on Bataan, I'll make you a lieutenant general." Wainwright didn't flinch. "I'll be on Bataan," he said, "if I'm still alive." At dark, MacArthur slipped out of Corregidor on 4 patrol torpedo boats. He carved through Japanese-controlled waters in a stormy sea. 4 days later, he landed in Australia, and he stood before the microphones and said the words the world would remember. "I came through, and I shall return." Back on Bataan, the men heard about it on the radio. Some understood, some didn't. One soldier wrote home, "We felt let down, even betrayed. We believed that if we'd been supplied, if someone had kept their word, we could have held." Wainwright didn't write letters like that. He had just been handed command of all remaining American forces in the Philippines, a command that every senior officer in Washington already knew was militarily hopeless. No reinforcements were coming, no resupply convoys, no air cover. Nothing was getting through the Japanese blockade, just the men in front of him, running on almost nothing, still fighting. He sent a cable to Washington, straight and plain, the way cavalrymen talk. My men will be starved into submission unless food arrives before April 15th. Washington received it. Washington did not reply. Wainwright folded the cable, set it down, and went back to the line. Now let's talk about what it actually meant to fight on Bataan, not the strategy, not the maps, what it meant in a man's body. By the end of January, the men were down to 1 meal a day. 1 meal, in a jungle, in 95-degree heat, carrying a rifle and a full pack. The Army's standard combat ration was 4,000 calories a day. These men were getting fewer than 1,000. Some lost 15 pounds in a month. Some lost 25. By late March, the men weren't losing weight anymore. There was nothing left to lose. The jungle gave them what it could. Monkey meat, boiled and salted, snake, iguana, roots, anything that could be caught, killed, and swallowed. The cavalry horses went last. Animals the men had trained with for years, fed by hand, brushed down, named. Wainwright gave the order himself. The horses were turned over to the quartermaster. Slaughtered for food, the men ate them without complaint, because there was nothing else. Then the sickness came. Malaria first, then dengue fever, then dysentery, then beriberi, a disease of severe malnutrition that swells a man's legs until he can barely walk and attacks his heart. The field hospitals ran out of quinine in February. Without quinine, malaria doesn't just make you sick, it keeps coming back, wave after wave. A man could be on the line in the morning, shaking with fever by afternoon, and back on the line again by the next dawn, because there was simply no one to replace him. Surgeons operated by flashlight, without enough anesthesia. Men bit down on leather straps while doctors worked on them. By March, disease was killing more men on Bataan than Japanese bullets were, and still they fought. Every morning Jonathan Wainwright was out there with them, not behind a desk, out there, in the mud, checking positions, sitting next to men who hadn't slept in 2 days. One of his officers said it simply, his presence on the line, that was what kept us going. Not orders, not speeches, just him being there. On Good Friday, April 3rd, 1942, the Japanese launched their final assault. General Hama had spent weeks waiting for reinforcements from Japan. Now they were here. Fresh troops, heavy artillery, full stomachs, against men who had been running on 1 bowl of rice a day for 3 months. The mathematics of it were unforgiving. Wainwright threw in every reserve he had. It wasn't enough. Day by day, the Japanese pushed south. On the morning of April 9th, Major General Edward King made a decision. Without informing Wainwright, without asking permission, he looked at his 75,000 men, sick, broken, out of ammunition, out of medicine, and he made the only call a decent man could make. He sent word to the Japanese. Bataan was surrendering. It was the largest surrender of American forces in history. Wainwright heard the news from Corregidor. He wrote later that a terrible silence settled over Bataan that morning. He could feel it from across the water. But the war was not over. 1 mile off the coast of Bataan, sitting in the mouth of Manila Bay, was a small fortified island called Corregidor, and Jonathan Wainwright was still on it. Corregidor was 2 square miles of rock and concrete sitting in the mouth of Manila Bay. The Japanese called it the cork in the bottle. As long as it held, they couldn't use the finest deep-water harbor in the Pacific. They needed it badly, and they were going to take it. After Bataan fell, every Japanese gun on the peninsula turned toward the island. Artillery, bombers, mortars, around the clock. The men lived underground, Inside the Malinta Tunnel, a network of concrete passages blasted into the rock. Hundreds of soldiers, nurses, and staff worked and slept and tried to breathe air that smelled of smoke and antiseptic and fear. The lights flickered with every hit. The walls shook. Dust fell from the ceiling like snow. Above ground, nothing stood for long. Buildings collapsed, gun emplacements buried under rubble. Men ran between positions with their heads down, counting the seconds between shell bursts. Wainwright moved through all of it, tunnel to surface, surface to tunnel, checking the guns, talking to the men, acting like a man who believed this island would hold, whether he believed it himself, that he kept to himself. On May 1st, he sent a radio message to President Roosevelt. He wrote it the way soldiers write, plain, no drama, just the facts. There is a limit of human endurance, and that point has long been passed. He was not asking for sympathy, he was stating a diagnosis. Calm, clear, final. 4 days later, May 5th, the Japanese came ashore. In the dark, just before midnight, landing craft pushed through the water toward Corregidor's beaches. The American and Filipino defenders were waiting, even exhausted, even on almost nothing. They hit those landing craft with everything they had left. The first wave of Japanese troops took devastating losses. Bodies in the water, boats burning. For a few hours it looked like the island might hold. It didn't. More boats came, then more. The Japanese had men to spend. The Americans did not. By the morning of May 6th, Japanese tanks were moving inland. Wainwright walked through the tunnel one last time. He looked at what was left. Wounded men on stretchers lining the walls. Nurses still working in the half-dark. Soldiers who had been fighting without adequate food for 4 months. He made his decision. He sent 2 officers forward under a white flag. Then he faced the Japanese himself. He would not send someone else to do that part. Wainwright surrendered Corregidor at 1:30 in the afternoon. He did it to stop the killing. He knew exactly what captivity under the Japanese meant. He did it because the men in that tunnel had already given everything a man can give, and he was not going to ask for one thing more. Before the Japanese took full control, American soldiers moved quickly through the tunnel. Code books fed into fires, classified documents burned. The regimental colors, the flags that had flown over American positions since December, were torn from their poles and set alight. No Japanese soldier would ever hold them. Wainwright stood and watched the flags burn. He knew what the world would say about him. He knew the word they would use. Surrender. He accepted that. What he could not accept, what was never an option, was walking out of that tunnel and leaving those men to be slaughtered. The Japanese moved Wainwright through a series of prison camps, first in the Philippines, then Taiwan, then to a remote compound in Manchuria, in the frozen north of Japanese-occupied China. He was the highest-ranking American prisoner of war in the entire conflict. It meant nothing. No private quarters, no special treatment. He stood in the same lines as everyone else, ate the same thin bowl of soup, slept on the same wooden planks. The weight came off steadily, until the man who had once stood lean and straight was somewhere around 125 pounds. Bones in a uniform. In the prison camp, he traded everything he owned, pens, his wristwatch, whatever he had, for scraps of information about MacArthur's advance. He did not know if it was working. He did not know about Midway. He did not know about Guadalcanal. He did not know about the Long Island hopping campaign slowly grinding its way toward Japan. He only knew one thing. He was still alive, and as long as he was alive, he was still a soldier of the United States Army. That was enough. It had to be. The men in that camp said later that Wainwright was what kept them going, not because he gave speeches, not because he had answers, but because every single morning he was there, upright, present, refusing to disappear. He called them to attention. He maintained formations, kept discipline, held the rituals of military life, not because regulations required it, because he understood something the guards did not. The moment you stop acting like a soldier, you stop being one. And if these men stopped being soldiers, they would have nothing left to hold on to. For 3 years and 3 months, Wainwright kept going, waking up each morning and deciding, again, to stay on his feet. The men who came home from those camps carried something with them for the rest of their lives. Some talked about it, most didn't. If someone in your family served in the Pacific, Army, Navy, Marines, Army Air Corps, put his name in the comments, his branch, where he served. These men's stories are slipping away from us faster than we realize. Don't let that happen. Here is something that history books don't always say out loud. Bataan was not just a defeat. Bataan was a transaction. Japan gave General Homma 50 days to conquer the Philippines. 50 days. And then his troops would be reassigned to push south through New Guinea, through the Solomon Islands, toward Australia. That was the plan. Clean, fast, unstoppable. It took 150 days. Think about what happened inside those extra 100 days. In June 1942, while Wainwright was already in a prison camp, the United States Navy met the Japanese fleet at a small island called Midway. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers went to the bottom of the Pacific. In a single day, the back of Japanese naval air power, broken. But Midway only happened because the Navy had time to prepare, time to reposition, time to crack the Japanese naval code and set the trap. That time was purchased on Bataan, bought with leather straps bitten down in field hospitals and men carrying rifles on legs that could barely hold them. After Midway came Guadalcanal. After Guadalcanal came the long push back, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, each one a step closer to Japan. None of it happens on the same timeline if the Philippines fall in 50 days, if Homma's troops redeploy south on schedule, if Australia gets hit before it's ready. Historians argue about what might have been. But this much is not disputed. The defense of Bataan and Corregidor delayed the entire Japanese timetable in the Southwest Pacific by 100 days. 100 days the rest of the Allied world used to fight back. Wainwright didn't know any of this from his camp in Manchuria. He didn't know what his men's suffering had made possible. He just kept waking up every morning, calling the men to attention, holding on in the only way he had left. In August 1945, the war ended. Soviet forces sweeping into Manchuria reached Wainwright's compound. American intelligence operatives had tracked him down just days before. He was free. For the first time in 3 years and 3 months, he was free. On August 31st, Wainwright was taken to the new Grand Hotel in Yokohama to meet MacArthur. MacArthur walked into the room. He saw Wainwright, the white hair, the hollowed face, the body held up by a cane. MacArthur stopped. He recognized the cane. It was the one he had given Wainwright before the war, meant as a swagger stick, a symbol of rank. For 3 years, Wainwright had used it to keep himself upright. MacArthur could not speak. The 2 men held each other. 2 days later, September 2nd, 1945, Wainwright was helped aboard the USS Missouri. When he reached the deck, he stood straight. The Japanese delegation came aboard at 9 in the morning. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, General Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff, the men who had prosecuted the war across the Pacific. They signed first. Then MacArthur stepped to the table, and standing directly behind him, close enough to reach out and touch his shoulder, was Jonathan Wainwright. MacArthur signed with 6 pens. When he finished, he turned and handed 2 of those pens to the men standing behind him. One to British General Percival, who had surrendered Singapore, one to Wainwright. The man who had surrendered the Philippines was handed the pen that accepted Japan's surrender. There are photographs of that moment. Wainwright is looking at the document on the table. His face is unreadable. But his eyes are the eyes of a man who has waited a very long time for something he was never sure he would live to see. 8 days later, President Harry Truman called Wainwright to the White House Rose Garden. He pinned the Medal of Honor on him personally. The citation read, in part, "Distinguished himself by intrepid and determined leadership against greatly superior enemy forces. At the repeated risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, he frequented the firing line of his troops, where his presence provided the example and incentive that helped make the gallant efforts of these men possible." On September 13th, New York City gave him a ticker tape parade. Thousands of people lining the streets, cheering for the man the newspapers had once called the general who lost the Philippines. He retired from the Army in 1947. He died on September 2, 1953, exactly 8 years to the day after Japan surrendered on the deck of the Missouri. He was buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The last men who fought on Bataan and Corregidor are in their late 90s now. In a few years, there will be no one left who can sit across from you at a kitchen table and tell you what it smelled like in that tunnel, what it felt like to eat 1 bowl of food a day for 3 months and still pick up a rifle, what it meant to hear that song on the radio, Ships That Never Come In, and decide that it didn't matter, that you were staying anyway. Jonathan Wainwright stayed. His men stayed. They bought something with their suffering that the rest of the world cashed in, at Midway, at Guadalcanal, and finally on the deck of the USS Missouri on a September morning in 1945. If your father was there, if your grandfather wore that uniform, Army, Navy, Marines, Army Air Corps, put his name in the comments below, his unit, where he served. Tell us his story. Because those men are why we're here, and their names deserve to be remembered for as long as there are people left to say them.